better one. I took a moment to appreciate how fucking clueless our guardians were. And I wasn't stupid. I knew as me and Carlisle took 4 business trips on the same weekends. There had to be something up with that shit. But I never asked. None of my business. Still, you'd think they'd see the parallels. I guess they didn't do a lot of talking on the business trips. My girl arrived at 10, right on time, and as I opened the door, noticed she was still trying to look pretty for me, her shiny curls blowing in the cold, misty breeze as she inched past me into the room, glancing at me sideways with a smile. Usually she would just unload my food on the bed after she walked in, but tonight she kind of stood in front of me after I closed the door, picking and pulling at the ends of her sleeves and looking like she was nervous as she gazed into my eyes. And I just took a fucking guess at the odd behavior and walked closer to her, watching as her eyes darted to my lips. I mentally smirked. She was so fucking transparent sometimes. I walked closer until I was nearly pressed up against her and slid my hand under all her shiny fucking curls and around her neck. I tilted her head up and watched her eyes fluttered closed as I leaned in and put my lips on hers. I decided, as I sucked on her bottom lip while cradling her little head in my hand, that if I was going to do something not so chaste, I should definitely do it before we got into that bed and I had her all pressed against me and every inch of my heart on. So I darted my tongue out and dragged it against her lips, which immediately opened. And since the switch was gone, when my girl licked my tongue and brought her little hands up to tangle in my hair with a sigh, I pressed her face closer to mine, shoving my tongue in her mouth and enjoying the fuck out of it. I wanted to feel her closer though, so I slid my other arm around her waist and pulled her to me, and she had her little hands fisted in my hair, pulling me closer and tilting her head so she could plunge her tongue into my mouth. And I was so fucking thankful we weren't doing this in the bed. But then I felt her body rub against my already quite obvious hard-on, and I groaned into her mouth. Reluctantly I pulled away from her lips, slightly breathless, giving her shiny fucking curls one last stroke. She stood there for a moment, kind of panting and licking her lips before she opened her eyes and smiled at me. I smiled back and just fucking shrugged in a gesture that clearly said I wouldn't mind adding that to the routine. She finally turned away when her face turned red and began unloading the meal on the bed. Determined to find the middle ground, where the new routine met the old, I flopped down on the bed and began doing my usual thing, while she shuffled her way to the sofa. I began devouring the casserole she brought and humming, while I watched her play the iPod. I decided I was going to get my girl her own iPod for Christmas. "What are you doing tomorrow?" I chewed, remembering my window of opportunity that Jazz provided. She glanced up at me from the iPod and smiled.
"Well, provided the Christmas Nazi doesn't detain me, probably nothing,"
she said quietly, shaking her head at something and making her shiny curls bounce everywhere. I furrowed my brows wondering who she was talking about, before I realized it must be Brandon. The name was so fucking fitting.
"Why?"
she asked, glancing up at me through her eyelashes. "This shit again." I gulped my bite of food. "I was thinking we could go to Port Angeles tomorrow," I mumbled, stabbing my casserole with my fork. She smiled wider and nodded, finally turning her gaze back to the iPod. I continued eating the food she brought me, mentally rolling my fucking eyes that she was still doing the flirting bit with me when she so obviously had me already.
"How will we meet?"
she muttered. I looked up from my food and she was staring at me, biting her lip. I wasn't sure if that was another flirting move or just fucking Bella. Either way it worked. I furrowed my brows at her question. "I'll park at the end of the road, just made me the right guess?" I asked as more of a question and sort of grimacing at the fact I was sneaking us around like we had something to be ashamed of or some shit. Which was not the case in the least. She nodded and looked back down at her iPod, still biting her lip. And then I felt like shit for not just having the balls to take her out like any normal fucking guy would. But I wasn't ready for everyone to know yet. And I had to wait until it felt right. So I let myself feel like shit for the rest of the meal. We talked a little bit after that while I sketched my girl's shiny fucking curls some more, and she listened to the iPod. She told me a little about Phoenix, but left out all the shit about the trial and Phil. I tried filling her in on all the shit she missed here, but there really wasn't much to say. And by 11, I was already tired again. So I shut my sketchbook indicating I was ready. She took the earbuds out and shuffled to the bathroom and changed. Once we were both done with our nightly routines, we got into bed and I turned out the light. A lot like last night, I bunched all her curls up on top of her head and nuzzled my way into them with a smile. I planted a soft kiss to the top of her head, satisfied with the fucking fantastic kiss I had earlier in the doorway. She didn't seem to mind. She just nuzzled deeper into my chest and began stroking my hair softly and humming my lullaby. I sighed into all her curls and fell asleep, somewhat excited for the quasi-nun date.